Hey, what's up YouTube? Joe here, back again with another Riftbound video. Today I just wanted to briefly go over some of the new cards in the Calm and Order domains that we are going to get in Vendetta, and take a look at any cards that we might want to include in our Leona deck, for example. I will give the cards maybe a general rating, and then give them a separate rating for how good they might be in Leona in particular. Make sure to like and subscribe if you've been enjoying the content, and let's get into it. First, starting out in the Calm domain. First, we have Steel Paws, a 1 energy 0 might unit. It does have Deflect notably, and it does have an Empower ability. You can pay 7 to give it +7. I think this is a pretty mediocre card. We have access to a lot of better early plays. I think you would want to play this early on into the game and maybe get value off of it later. But with cards like Scuttle Crab, Lonely Poro, etc., I don't think it's really going to replace those cards at all. Maybe support for Ivern or maybe support for Nasus, but definitely not for Leona. I think I'd rate this card pretty low on the chain, maybe like a 1 or 2 out of 10. Next we have Old Poro. This is a 2 energy for 4 might unit, which sounds pretty good until you read the effect. It can't be played on the first, second, or third turn, so we're really not allowed to play this card. So I can't really see us putting it in the deck. I think it's hard to justify the small stat line bonus for the downside of really not being able to play this card, especially since games can easily be decided by the fourth turn of the game. So I'd probably give this maybe a 1 or 2 out of 10 as well. Next, we have Mournful Witness, 2 energy for 2 might unit. When a combat that I was in ends, empower me, and it has +2 when empowered. I could see this card being useful in some cases, maybe, where you move it in, maybe with a Vi or something else, and it survives the combat, and you get the +2. I think this card was more meant for Akali, being able to maybe move the card in and move it out to start and end a combat just to get the empowerment. It's decent, but I don't think it's going to replace, of course, our other premium 2-drop options like the Lonely Poro or the Scuttle Crab. I think Stalwart Poro is just coming out with that shield already, and it doesn't need any other conditions to get that additional might bonus. So interesting card, but I'd probably rate this maybe a 4 out of 10. I still think it's not going to be too useful for Leona. Maybe it would be a bit better in the Akali deck. But yeah, moving on. Riven. It's a 3 energy and 1 power cost for a 3 might. It has Weapon Master, and when I attack, choose an enemy unit here, deal 2 damage for each equipment attached to me. I think in general, this card might be good in other equipment decks. Maybe Azir or Ornn would want to make use of this, so it could have some viability there. But for Leona, I think it's probably useless as we don't really run a lot of equipments, so it doesn't have much synergy with our deck. I think overall, I'd rate this card maybe a 3 out of 10. Next, we have Tomb Raider Barbara, a 4 energy for 4 might unit with the effect that if you control 7 or more runes, you can choose an enemy gear. If it's empowered, disempower it or kill it. I think this is another gear removal option with a few conditions attached. In general, I fail to see how this is going to be more useful than our existing options like Disarming Rake, for example. It has a decent stat line, but we're not getting too much more utility out of it than other cards, so I'd rate this maybe a 2 out of 10. Maybe in the future, the disempower effect is going to be relevant, but right now I don't really see it. Next, we have the Field Musicians, 4 energy for 3 might. It does on play give another unit 3 might this turn. Effectively, you're getting the 6 might for 4 energy. I think this is could be useful, but it is more like a vanilla card. Maybe I'd rate this like a 4 or 5 out of 10 just on the stats that it provides alone, but probably won't see play in many decks and probably not in Leona either. Next, we have the Akali Silent, 4 energy and 1 power cost for 4 might. It can't be chosen by enemy spells and abilities unless it's in combat, and then when it moves, it gets a +2. This is a pretty interesting unit, as we see with cards like Ruin Runner. Being unable to get chosen by our opponent's effects can be a pretty strong effect. The only issue with that is we only get that effect while we're in the base. So if we do go into the battlefield to interact with our opponent, they are going to be able to use their interaction. It does have a nice might bonus, but of course that's only when it does move to a battlefield. So this is meant to synergize more with the Akali strategy, which can move their units in and out. I think it's a pretty solid card in general. Maybe I'd give this a 5 or 6 out of 10. I can definitely see this being played in the champion zone for that deck. But for Leona, I don't think it really aligns with our game plan, and the power cost is not something we want to be paying on turn 2 when we play this card. But I can definitely see the potential, and it might end up being a pretty good card. And it looks like the rest of the units here, we have Shen, 5 energy and 1 power cost for 6 might. If there's exactly one other unit when you hold, you can draw one. I think this unit is probably too expensive for us. We're getting into the Starcross fodder range. A lot of these units like Esteemed Hierophant, Astral Heron, Sandstone Chimera, and Gnosis are just simply too expensive when so many removals and return to hand effects exist in the game. So it's hard to justify playing any of these cards in Leona. I think individually they'd probably rate pretty mediocre or low as well. Maybe Shen can make better use of this card as this aligns more to their game plan, and Gnosis probably makes better use of the Astral Heron. But yeah, for Leona, we're not interested in any of these cards. Moving on to the spells, we do have the Twilight Shroud. This is an interesting card and maybe one that we could play in Leona. It costs 1 energy, and we get to give a friendly unit +1, and it also can't be chosen by enemy spells and abilities this turn. So, of course, as we saw with the Akali before, this is a pretty strong effect. And if you do combine this with the Akali champion, for example, you could use this before you enter a battlefield, effectively making your Akali untargetable for most of the game, which is pretty cool. It does have flow, so you get to play this card an additional time. So you're pretty much getting 2 cards for the price of 1, which is a pretty good deal. The downsides to this card, of course, is that it is a slow speed. It's not reaction speed or even action speed, so we're only going to be using it on the attack when we're going to try to break into our opponent's battlefield. It's definitely going to be more effective against certain decks than others. Decks like Vex or hold strategies that have cards like Back Off and Existential Dread and a bunch of tricks to, either stun your unit or take it out of the fight with some effect like that. It can be pretty useful to break into those battlefields. On the flip side, against Master Yi, for example, they are going to be empowering their own units, so the untargetable effect is not going to come into play too much. Notably, this card doesn't protect you against reaction speed spells that your opponent can play in response to the Twilight Shroud, so it does limit the scope of the cards that this is going to help us against. That being said, I can still see the value in the effect, and it could potentially belong in the sideboard for some of our matchups. This card probably works better with the Akali and even Irelia strategies for Leona. I'm not sure it's going to add too much to our deck. In general, I'd probably rate this card around like a 5 out of 10, and probably a bit lower in Leona. Next, we have the Crumbling Sands. So this is a 1 energy, 1 power cost, reaction speed spell. If your opponent plays another spell this turn, you can counter that one. This reads like another copy of Defy that can counter any spell, not just ones with a particular cost. But the problem is that if you're going into a combat against your opponent and they're playing multiple spells in the same stack or the same chain, I believe that they have to resolve to be considered played. So Crumbling Sands is going to be used on maybe a follow up chain, which might not be a situation that you find yourself in often. I believe it also has a bit of anti synergy with Defy. If we go ahead and Defy maybe the first spell they play, I don't believe that it is considered played after that spell gets countered. They'd have to play, I think, 3 spells total for you to counter the third spell. This card could become relevant depending on the meta, and maybe it would be in our sideboard, but I can't really see it being played in the main deck right now. That being said, it is a counter spell and it always has potential with that. So I'd rate this card right now maybe a 4 or 5 out of 10. Not sure if it's going to see play in Leona, but definitely a card to keep an eye on. Next, we have the Decree of Focus, so the Decree spells, which are meant to counter certain opposing domains. It is a 1 energy reaction. We can choose a friendly unit that's in combat with a Fury unit, or that's being chosen by a Fury spell, and give it +4. It's a pretty well statted card when you are up against the Fury domain. That being said, it's useless against everything else. So at best, this is going to be in our sideboard. But since our sideboard slots are already pretty limited, I'm not sure if we're going to have space for this. It's definitely a meta call where if we expect a lot of decks in the Fury domain to be present, we can think about including it. Otherwise, I'm not sure how useful it's going to be. For the rating, of course, it would be like an 8 or 9 out of 10 against the Fury domain and a 0 out of 10 against everything else. So that averages out to being pretty mid in general. Definitely a card to keep in mind depending on where the meta goes. Next, we have Resonating Strike, 2 energy, 1 power cost spell. It has hidden and it has reaction speed. You can choose a battlefield you control and a unit you control at a different location. Move that unit to that battlefield and give it +2 this turn. So this kind of functions as like a tide turner if you were going to move one of your units and base into the battle, I believe. I'm not a huge fan of effects like this, conditional move effects that may or may not be useful in the game state. I don't think it's a card that you want to play around. I generally move my units back to base and to battlefields as necessary. more in line with what the game state demands. I think too that if you're contributing more units to potentially losing combat, you kind of risk getting fully blown out. If you have that unit in base, you can always follow up to attack next turn. So it kind of increases the risk of the combat that you're committing to in that case. I'm not a huge fan of this card. I think I'd give it maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10. Maybe it has a much better synergy in the Akali deck where they have a lot of move effects that they are going to make use of. But in Leona, I think it's going to be a bit dubious to be playing around this card. So yeah, moving on. We have the Hand Hammer. This is a 2 energy equipment. You can equip a 2 unit by recycling a rune, and it has +2 while the unit equipped is at a battlefield with exactly 1 other unit you control. So this is leaning toward more of the Shen strategy and the condition that Shen is trying to reach, having exactly 2 units at a battlefield. And you are going to get a bit of a might bonus there. You'll end up getting the 3 might for the 2 energy, which isn't a bad deal. The problem for Leona, of course, is that this is a equipment. It doesn't align with our strategy. We don't want to be recycling a lot of runes to re-equip our units over and over again. And it's definitely a much weaker buff if you can't establish exactly 2 units at the battlefield. This is probably even on the weaker side for decks like Azir who do want to use the equipments. So in general, I'd probably give this card maybe a 2 out of 10, and it's definitely not going to see play in Leona from what I can see right now. Finally, we have the Helm of Suppression. 4 energy and 1 power cost. You get to make your opponent's spells cost 1 more. You can empower it and then make your opponent's spells also cost 1 more power. So kind of giving them a blanket Vex Cheerless ability. This can be pretty good, I think, against the spell heavy decks, but it is a pretty expensive gear. And as we see, a lot of decks do have access to very potent gear removal. There's probably going to be a ton of gear removal going around. So this card is definitely going to be better against some decks than others. For that reason, I believe it's probably a sideboard card at best. In general, I'd probably give this card maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10. And I doubt this is going to be seeing play in Leona anytime soon. And now moving on to the order domain. It looks like the first unit that we have here is the Fallen Feline. 2 energy and 1 power for 3 might. When you play me, name a spell, and while I'm at a battlefield, opponents can't play spells with that name. So this is a unique effect, similar to maybe Prohibition and Yu-Gi-Oh! And cards like that. It is competing for a 2-drop slot with all of our other wonderful 2-drops, of course. So it's going to be a pretty tall order to outclass those cards. It does have the power cost, which we are not looking to pay on turn 1, of course. Depending on which deck you're against, the effect might come in handy, but it seems a bit dubious right now. Probably be easy for your opponent to remove if it was a problem for them, only being 3 might and having to remain at that battlefield. It would be pretty vulnerable, so they probably will be able to take it out. So yeah, in general, I'd probably rate this a 2 or 3 out of 10. I don't think it's going to see play in Leona. I think we have much better cards in the 2-drop slot. And we already have, our counter spells if we need to deal with particular troublesome spells, for example. But yeah, moving on here. We have the Disciple of Shen, 2 energy for 1 might. It does have Hidden, and then when it's at a battlefield with exactly 1 other unit, you have the Shield 3, so definitely meant for the Shen strategy. If you do accomplish that condition, the card is quite strong, right? A hidden card that can potentially give you 4 might on the defense, which is decent stats. The problem is that if you do have to play this card on turn 2, it's going to be pretty weak, and of course, it's not going to be better than the other 2-drop units we have available, so probably won't see play in Leona, might see play in Shen. I'd give this card maybe a 4 out of 10 in Shen, and then maybe a 2 out of 10 in other decks. Next, we have Kennen, the Keeper of Balance, 3 energy for 2 might. It does have Hidden, and then when you play me or I attack, you may pay 2 energy to stun a unit. And while there's a stun enemy unit here, I have +2. So this is one of the few cards that is actually going to benefit our strategy. In Leona, we do have the extra synergy with our legend to generate a buff off of that stun. So effectively, if we send the Kennen into attack and we end up stunning a unit, we are going to be generating a buff and going up to 5 might for the cost of 5 energy, which is pretty good. The problem is that this Kennen is competing with the existing slot for Nami in our main deck, and Nami is a pretty insane card too. There are a few downsides that I see where if you do try to hide it and keep it as a combat trick on your opponent's turn, you do have to leave up the 2 energy for the on-play effect. Otherwise, it's basically just going to be a 2 might body. Maybe combined with a back off from hand, it can be a bit more effective, but at that point, you might just want to be setting the back off in those cases and leaving up energy for something else, maybe a discipline or something like that. And another downside is the fact that we're going to have to repeatedly pay the cost to turn Kennen into a real unit. So the first time you attack, you're going to be going up to 5 might with the bonus of the stun enemy unit and the buff. So you're getting, 5 for 5 plus the stun and the buff, which is a good value. But after that, the card is going to keep getting more expensive. Every time you want to attack with it again, you're going to have to keep paying that 2 energy. 2 energy is a lot. Of course, we could use that energy to use for a discipline, a defy on our opponent's turn. We're 1 energy shy of holding up a back off, for example. We do also have cards like Hidden Blade and Not So Fast that we might want to be casting on our opponent's turn. So that energy is actually pretty important for our other interactions that we want to hold up. So having to repeatedly pay that energy cost when you go in is going to be pretty bad for us. Notably, if you do play this unit on turn 1 going second and you go to attack a battlefield and use its effect, that leaves you with 3 runes and you're unable to develop a strong turn 2 play like a Fiora or an Irelia, for example. I think it's definitely worth giving a try, though. I think in our deck, maybe I'd rate it, maybe a 5 or 6 out of 10. It's definitely playable and it has its benefits. But right now, I can't see it taking over the 3-drop slot that we have for Nami. So moving on, we have Kale, 3 energy for 3 might with Empower 3. It looks like you're able to just keep empowering this card and then eventually gets Deflect 3 and ganking. It's an interesting card, but of course, as we see, investing too many resources into one unit can be a bit dangerous against removal and return to hand effects like Starcrossed, and I think now we even have Wind and Ghosts. So plenty of effects to deal with single strong units in the game right now. I think it's better to distribute your resources and maybe play additional units instead of continuing to empower the Kale. It is a cool effect, and the base stats of the unit are fair. So I'd probably give this a 4 or 5 out of 10. Maybe it sees play in the future with a Kale Legend, which could be pretty cool. Moving on, we have the Escaped Greyback. It's a 3 for 3 empower, kill a friendly unit, and then gets +2. Pretty decent card in a lot of the other order strategies, like maybe like a Victor or a Zir, for example. But it's basically just a vanilla unit. So I'd give this maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10. It's a relatively vanilla card. Next, we have Reluctant Leader, 4 energy and a power for a 3 might unit. And when you play another unit, it gets +2. So again, maybe more applicable to the swarm strategies. The base stat line is pretty weak, and it does cost the power for a card that you might want to be playing on turn 2. So you definitely don't want to be recycling the runes that early if you can avoid it. I think in general, I'd give this card maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10, and I probably wouldn't play it in Leona. Next, we have the Sacred Protector, a 4 energy and 1 power for a 6 might unit, and it doesn't deal combat unless it's at a battlefield with exactly one other unit you control. So this unit can't really do anything on its own. It has to be with another unit at a battlefield. This is more geared towards the Shen strategy. I'd probably rate this maybe a 2 out of 10. I think it's pretty weak, and you might not always be able to accomplish the condition, and it definitely won't see play in Leona, as far as I can see. We do, of course, have the Overnumber Leona Determined art, which is great to see. I think this card looks great, and I can't wait to see it in person. But yeah, unfortunately, we're not running Leona Determined right now in the deck, but maybe it could return at some point. Next, we have Masa Crashing Thunder, 4 energy for 4 might. You may pay 1 power as an additional cost, and if you played the additional cost, stun an enemy unit at a battlefield. So this is another on-play stun effect similar to Nami and Solari Shieldbearer. It does have decent stats, of course, getting that 4 for 4. I think in general, I'd rate this unit maybe a 5 out of 10. I think it's relatively decent, and it does have synergy with our Leona strategy, being able to generate a buff from that stun, of course. I think right now in Leona, we do have better options for on-play stun effects, especially later on in the game when we might not be able to afford the 4 energy. For example, if we wanted to combo with Leona Zealot, we would only need 9 energy if we combo it with Zenith Blade or Nami, for example. But it is solid, and I might end up testing it out, but I don't think it's going to be better than maybe some of our existing options. Moving on to Ambessa, a 5 energy for 5 might. It has Empower for 1 energy and 2 power, and when empowered, it will have Assault 2 and kill an enemy unit here with less might than me. So this card is kind of interesting. It's like a mini Atacon. Of course, it's going to work better in the Ambessa strategy when they have access to more movement effects. So in general, I might rate this card, a 5 or 6 out of 10, maybe even a 7 out of 10 for the Ambessa strategy if it ends up working out there. For Leona, though, I don't think this is going to be better than other cards like Vi and our 5 cost slot. I think this card might be too slow for us as we don't have the same movement effects accessible through our Legend, for example. But you are getting a fair stat line, so it might be a decent card, but just not playable in our Leona deck. Next, we have the Keeper of the Law, 5 energy and 1 power for 5 might. It costs less if you control a battlefield with exactly 2 units, so probably made for Shen, being able to use this to reinforce the existing battlefield and maybe move back one of your units. By itself, it is just a vanilla monster with a power cost attached to it, so not really a card I would rate too highly. I'd probably give this maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10, and it's probably not going to make it into our Leona deck. Next, we have the Shen, leader of the Kinku Order, costing 6 energy and 2 power for a 7 might unit. It does have shield, defending for 8. And when I hold, if there's exactly one other unit you control here, you score 1 point. So of course this aligns with the Shen strategy. It's a pretty important effect for hold decks. If they lose the die roll and they're going to be playing from behind the point tempo, it could be difficult for them to double conquer. So they might look for effects like this to, get that additional point to take the lead when they're still just holding one battlefield, similar to how the green Ari functions. It does have a pretty expensive cost and is definitely going to be vulnerable against those removal and return to hand effects. I think I'd rate this relatively low, maybe a 2 or 3, maybe a bit higher in the Shen strategy, and definitely lower in Leona. We're probably not going to play this card. Next is the Horns of the Dragon, 6 energy for 6 might, and it has tank. Just a vanilla unit, decently statted, but probably not going to make it into our deck. It's not really offering much more than that. Next is Key Barrier, getting into the spells, 2 energy and 1 power cost. Reaction spell, choose a unit and prevent the next 7 damage that would be dealt to it this turn. So kind of like a Jack's Counter Strike, except we have a limit to the amount of damage that it can prevent, and it also doesn't draw a card. I think this card is relatively low impact. There are other good options, for example, like Tactical Retreat that can save our unit without the power cost. Although that does get retreated and returned to base. Maybe it can find a use in certain matchups, but I think in general, we already have plenty of strong buff spells and reaction spells that we're going to use to interact with our opponent. I think in general, I might rate this like a 3 or 4 out of 10. But yeah, probably not going to see play in our Leona deck, unless decks that have a lot of removal spells that deal damage become popular. Like notably, this card can protect you against Falling Star, for example, and Singularity and those types of spells, but we do have additional counterspell options in the set. But yeah, maybe a card to keep an eye on, but I don't see any potential in it right now. Next, we have Lacerate, 2 energy and 1 power. Choose a unit. You can disempower it and then kill it if it has 3 might or less. And then it does also have the additional flow cost, being pretty expensive at a 4 energy and 2 power. So similar to a Vengeance, for example. It's strong removal, but I think it's too expensive for us to warrant playing in most cases, especially in Leona, as we are only able to kill a unit that has 3 might or less. So if you think about cards like Gust that can efficiently deal with the same type of unit, we're not really getting a good price for this effect, I think. In general, I'd rate this maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10, and we're definitely not going to be putting this in Leona. So moving on here to the Dragon form. This is a 3-cost spell. Choose a unit. Its base might becomes 5, and it has flow, so you can replay it for the same cost and get the same effect. Notably, it changes the base might of the unit to 5. It's not going to buff or increase the might of our units. So this is maybe for swarm strategies like Victor that get basically an effective +4 out of using this on one of their tokens. The flow is nice. Having access to basically 2 copies of the card for just 1 main deck slot. I think it is going to be pretty underwhelming in Leona, as we already have, very powerful buffs at reaction speed. I think this being a slow speed spell does definitely hurt it. It does work pretty well with Scuttle Crab, of course, being able to get a +5 for 3 energy, but of course you're not always going to have the Scuttle Crab plus Dragon form. In general, I'd rate this maybe a 3 or 4 out of 10, maybe a bit higher in swarm strategies like Victor that are always going to make use of the might bonus on their units, but in Leona, this loses a lot of value. I'd probably give this maybe a 1 or 2 out of 10. I don't think we'll be playing this card. Next, we have the Glowstone, 2 energy gear. You can empower this for 2 power, and then disempower it to choose a player, and they gain control of this. At the end of the turn, Glowstone is going to pop and deal 5 damage to all your units. A bit of a meme card that if we're sending this back and forth between us and our opponent, we're basically going to be locking our energy, as we only get 2 new runes every turn. Decks that utilize this card are definitely going to be playing Seals, I would assume. But yeah, in general, it's probably not a card that we are going to make that much use of. I'd probably rate this card on the lower side, maybe a 1 or 2 out of 10 for most decks. And if your strategy is going to be playing Seals and trying to make use of the energy lock, maybe it can be a bit more effective. But yeah, definitely not for Leona. And finally, we have the Shady Spectacles, 4 energy. and then a 1 energy and 1 power equip cost. As this is attached to a unit, choose another friendly unit. The equip unit becomes a copy of that unit for as long as this is attached to it. So I guess if you have one really strong unit and one really weak unit, you can turn that smaller unit into a copy of the bigger one. Paying for energy is relatively expensive. Of course, as I say with gears in general, they're always weak to the removal and the repeated equip cost, which can be a bit of a detriment. In general, I'd rate this card maybe a 4 or 5 out of 10. I think there's potential for some decks to make use of this, and it could end up being pretty good. But in Leona, I'd rate it a lot worse. I don't think we're going to make great use of this card. There's not really a lot of good units for us to copy. Maybe playing this and then playing Leona Zealot to copy that effect could be useful, but I don't have high hopes for it right now. Next, we can take a look at the battlefields. We have Risen Altar, and power costs are reduced, so this is going to be good for decks making use of the Empower mechanic, but probably not something we're going to play in Leona. The Sandswept Tomb. Each spell that chooses one or more units here that are friendly to it costs 1 power less. So this could be good in the body domain, for example. They can pay 1 power less for the punch first, but I think our buff spells generally don't cost power. We have Call to Glory, Discipline. I guess Zenith Blade could technically be reduced by this if we Zenith Blade a unit at the Sandswept Tomb to another battlefield. We could get some potential use out of this card, but I think in general, our other battlefield choices are going to be more effective for us. The next battlefield is High Show, Shell of the World. Players ignore Deflect while paying for spells and abilities, choosing something here. This is probably going to be more useful for decks in the Mind and Chaos domain that have a lot of debuffs that are choosing our opponent's units. I think our strategy is mainly going to be buffing up our own units. I think in general, we're not going to get too much value out of this. It really doesn't change our game plan or give us anything to play for ourselves, like the Monastery and the Sunken Temple, for example. We really want to be getting value out of our battlefields if we can. So while this effect might come up, I think it's relatively weak, so I can't really see it being included in our deck right now. Next is the Protective Sands. When you conquer here, if you control 4 or fewer runes, you may pay 1 energy to draw 1. This is probably meant for Renekton, which is going to be recycling the runes aggressively to play strong units out very early on into the game. Our strategy, of course, is to avoid recycling runes early and ramp into our later game finishers, right, with the Leona Zealot and the Zenith Blade plays. So we're probably not going to get any use out of this battlefield. Next, we have the Dragon Roost. Any player may pay 2 power as an additional cost to play a dragon, and if they do, they play it to this battlefield. So this can allow your dragons to act as a sneaky deckhand or a Dreadbloom Predator, essentially. So probably will be useful for those dragon archetype decks, but I don't believe we're playing any dragons, so probably won't be able to get much use out of this one. Next, we have the Mystic Vortex. During showdowns, cards with reaction cost 1 power more to play. This is going to be pretty effective against spell decks, giving you a mini Vex Cheerless effect on the battlefield during a showdown. This battlefield is going to work quite well against us, but of course, it's probably not one that we're going to be playing, as we have a lot of reaction cards that we will want to be playing during the showdown, and we're definitely not going to want to play this battlefield in our own strategy. Finally, we have the Kinku Temple. Units here with tank have +1. I assume this is meant for Shen or other decks that are going to hold with tank units potentially. It's a nice little bonus, but of course we aren't going to be benefiting off of this battlefield that much. I don't think we are running a lot of powerful tank units in our deck right now. So it might be useful in some other strategies, but yeah, definitely a bit underwhelming for Leona. So that's going to wrap things up for the review. I tried to get through, the cards relatively quickly. I think a lot of these cards are pretty weak compared to what we already have access to. And honestly, I don't think the Leona list that I have right now is going to change that much. Of course, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and maybe if there's some potential or potential interactions I might have missed in my review. But yeah, I think there are a few more reveals that we have yet to see, but I think for the most part, all of the cards in the set are pretty much out. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.